Guys, what is up? Welcome back to the Letterbox Workshop. I'm not in the shed today. In the UK, we're just about to go into phase 2 of our lockdown, which means for the next 4 weeks, I'm not going to be able to go to the shed unless I jog there and jog back and class it's my daily exercise, which may be pushing it a little bit. I haven't quite decided yet. Nonetheless, thankfully, I've got lots of editing to catch up with, so I am sat here in my hotel room in Copenhagen just doing some video editing. In today's video, we are going to be rebuilding the Honda CB750 dual overhead cam engine. So this one runs from about 79 onwards, I believe. Mine's an 82, but they should all be pretty much the same. So if you've got one of these bikes and you want to see a bit more about how the engine works, or if you're thinking about doing a rebuild yourself, then stay tuned. Right guys, let's start by talking about what tools you are going to need for this rebuild. So this is going to be done in about 5 episodes, this rebuild. So I'll just focus on the tools that you need for the first part. So we're talking about taking off the head of the bike, the valves, and all the way down to the pistons, but not touching the bottom crankcase at all. So first of all, you're going to need a Honda CB750 dual overhead cam engine. Now I say this because this video is very specific to that engine. You may find that there are other displacements where the procedure is generally the same, but this video is done for the CB750. You are going to need this on a workbench with all the oil drains. Now, getting the engine out of this bike is not a straightforward process. I have made a video on this. So if you're just starting out and your bike still has the engine fitted, I will link it below and at the end, but you do need to get your engine on a workbench on a stable surface somehow. You're going to need a manual for the bike. This video is not intended as a replacement for a workshop manual. It's as a supplementary material. I'm just going to share some of the techniques I've learned taking this engine to pieces and rebuilding it. But in the first instance, I do recommend the official Honda shop manual. It's called, that's what I've used. Alternatively, you can get the Climber and Haynes manuals to this bike, both of which are excellent and have plenty of pictures and descriptions for how to do this rebuild. If you're looking for the official Honda shop manual, it is available on all the usual Honda forums. That being said, if you subscribe to the channel, I will soon be launching my own version of this document. It's greatly cleaned up over the original. It's all labelled correctly. I'm going to be annotating it with advice that I've found as I've done this bike that's been helpful. So if you're interested in that, subscribe to the channel and I'll be launching that in the coming months. You're going to need a selection of cloths, WD-40, degreaser and latex gloves. If your bike is anywhere near the state mine is in, this is going to help protect your hands. The bikes are filthy. You've got to remember this is getting on 40 years old, this bike. So that's just going to help you work safely and cleanly. The biggest tool you're going to need is a decent metric socket set. So some of you in America may be more familiar with imperial sizes on your nuts and bolts. This is a Japanese bike, so you are going to need metric sockets. I used a 1/2 inch set, but a 3/8 is equally applicable for removing these, but just make sure the actual sockets themselves are in millimeters. You're going to need just an assortment of light hand tools, screwdrivers, Allen keys and pliers, always useful. One thing you're going to specifically need is a JIS screwdriver. I bought one made by a company called Vessel. It was about 15 or 20 bucks, I think. I'll link it below if you're interested. But some of the screws on this bike, they will look like Phillips heads, but they're not. They are Japanese industrial standards. So buying a screwdriver, make sure you can get those out cleanly. And you're not going to risk stripping the head off them. I bought a pack of these plastic shims from the local hardware store. They're intended for packing out timber when you're doing carpentry work, but are extremely useful when you're trying to separate engine casings for slotting into narrow gaps and supporting the engine. I'll explain more as the video goes, but if you happen to be in the hardware shop and you see these, they're normally about $5 a pack. Do grab a set, it'll be extremely useful indeed. You're either going to need a rubber hammer or a regular hammer and a few blocks of wood. There are going to be components on this engine that will have seized into place and will need a little tap to move them. Having a rubber hammer or using a piece of timber just protects the engine. It's aluminium, so it's very, very soft. So you do need to think about that in advance. I bought a set of these picks on eBay. I think these were $1 or so, including shipping from China. I have to say, the quality is actually surprisingly good, and I'd probably use these more than any other tool in my workshop. They're really, really, really useful. Again, I'll link them below, but when you're trying to get your fingers into really tight little corners, you're going to need these things. Finally, I recommend getting a set of Ziploc bags and a Sharpie. Every single nut, bolt, washer, as it comes off the engine, you want to put it straight into a bag, label it and store it. Now, putting these good practices in place from day one in your workshop will make this 10 times easier to rebuild this bike. Don't do what loads of people do, take a load of components off and think I'll bag it up at the end of the day, then get carried away building the engine, and before you know it, you've got a box of parts and a nightmare on your hands. So set up good practices right from the start, be disciplined. It doesn't sound very exciting, but trust me, it will make your life so much easier. So that's what you're going to need. Let's crack on with the rebuild. So first off, we're going to remove the cylinder head cover. This is held in place by 8 cylinder head cover bolts. It's always good practice with these to work in a crisscross pattern so that you release the tension evenly. With the 8 bolts removed, the head cover should lift off easily. Get into good practice at this place, bag, label the parts, and you can note at this point that the 4 central bolts are slightly longer than the outers. Right in the centre of the engine we have a cam chain guide and an oil line. These can be removed by removing the 3 retaining bolts. So next up we're going to remove the camshaft holders. These must be removed in the order Bravo, Charlie, Hotel, Juliet. I'll show you these now. The letters are embossed onto the camshaft holders themselves, but just be aware that Bravo and Charlie, the letters are covered by a small tab. Also be aware that 2 bolts have already been removed with the oil line, so if you find these missing, don't worry. There are 2 small plastic oil caps. These should be able to be lifted free now. A single bolt in the centre of the engine holds the cam chain guide retaining plate. This can be removed at this point. The camshaft holders are aligned with a small metal dowel pin, 2 on each holder. The easiest way of removing these is a pair of needle nose pliers. Some of the dowels are going to remain in the holders and others are going to remain with the engine. Just make sure you collect these all up and chuck them in the bag along with the holders. If any of these dowel pins are really stuck in place, the easiest way I found of getting them out was just to use a vice grip to get a strong grip on them and then to twist and hammer from the back at the same time. This released the 1 or 2 that I had seized on my engine. On the front of the engine there's a cam chain tensioner, lock nut and bolt. This can be loosened right off. With With the lock nut loosened, you should be able to push down on the lower side of the cam chain. Maintaining pressure on this, tighten up the cam chain lock nut again, and this should hold the cam chain in a loosened state with some play in it. On the rear of the engine, you're going to find another chain tensioner. Loosen this, then using a vice grip, work the rear cam chain loose and tighten the adjusting nut as before. Unfortunately, my camera failed to record the video of this section. We need to remove the pulsar generator cover. This should be the only one on the bike with the Honda logo on it. Behind this, you'll find a large nut which will allow you to cycle the engine around. You want to turn this until a small character 1.4 appears in the window at the top. This tells you that cylinders 1 and 4 are in the highest position. If you've got this right, the lobes should be positioned the same as in the video. As long as the lobes on cylinder 1 are pointing at each other, you're good. Next up, we can remove the camshaft holders Golf, Kilo, Foxtrot and Lima in that order, although I just released the tension on these gradually as before. Again, make sure you collect the dowel pins as you go and bag these along with the camshaft holder. With all 4 camshaft holders removed, the intake camshaft can be lifted out through the cam chain. The exhaust cam sprocket is a large cog at the front of the engine. It's held in place by 2 small bolts. These can now be removed. Just be aware you may have to turn the engine through 180 degrees to access the second bolt. Once you have both of these bolts out, we're going to remove the remaining camshaft holders. These need to go in the order Delta, tachometer gear, Alpha and then Echo. I've labelled the tachometer near GR in these diagrams and it is visibly different to the other camshaft holders. this point I decided it was a good time to remove the gasket, although realistically you can remove this at any point. Next off, we're going to remove the exhaust camshaft. Now be aware, when you do this, the timing chain is liable to drop into the engine case. I found that a short 12-inch length of steel or timber put in place just to prevent it dropping works perfectly. It's recommended with these chains that they're reinstalled in the same orientation as they're removed from the engine, i.e. you want them to work in tension in the same direction, not to reverse them. Now these are quite oily, so it's quite difficult to actually mark up how these go around. This is how the chain went in this engine. What they want to avoid is it being flipped over when you reinstall it. So with this particular chain, I installed a set of cable ties on the top edge. So I know where the cable ties are is the top of the engine, and I've put a pair at the front and a single cable tie at the rear. That just means in a few months' time, when I come to reinstalling this, I know it's in the same order. I'm not running the risk of any Sharpie ink having run off these parts, and I can 100% guarantee it'll be going in the right way. So just have a think about how you're going to do it, but this is how I did it. On the rear of the engine, you've got a short S-shaped oil line. This could be unbolted. Now it's really easy to damage this. As you undo the two bolts, you can twist the actual oil line itself and kink that, which will then restrict the oil flow to the head, which you definitely do not want. So what I did was just use a small spanner on the two nuts at the end of the oil line itself, and then the bolts can be safely removed without any risk of twisting. While we're on this side of the engine, the two cam chain tensioner lock nuts can be removed entirely. On the front of an engine, you should have a small plate showing you the size of the engine. There's two small bolts underneath these. These can now be removed. Next up, we're going to remove the 12 domed or acorn nuts on the top of the engine. It's important you do this in a crisscross pattern similar to the sequence I'm using here, and just do a quarter turn or so on each nut as you take them out. Now these can be fairly tight, and you may find you need to use a small hammer on your spanner to release these. I highly recommend you don't use a torque wrench, so it's very easy to strip the bolts that go on these, and then that's one hell of a job to repair them. So just work slowly and gently and you should get there. After several passes, you should have most of the tension removed from these, and you should just be able to remove them fully. With these nuts removed, we can now start to remove the cylinders. This is where you want to use your rubber mallet or a piece of timber to protect the engine lock if you've only got a steel hammer. The important thing here is to take it really slowly, just get it a millimetre or two on each side. Once I got a small gap, I inserted one of my plastic shims into it. You may find that the head just wants to rock back and forth as you remove it. The shims give it something to push against and prevent this happening. This should make it a lot easier. So you can see a lot better here how I've used these little plastic packers. You'll find that when you apply pressure upwards on one end, all that will happen is it will pivot through the centre of the engine and the other end will go down. So to prevent this happening and it just seesawing back and forth through the centre of the engine, you want to put a few plastic packers in each side as you go. This then means the engine's got something to bear against so that it doesn't drop when you hit the other end, and you just gradually insert 1 or 2 millimetres of packers at a time, just to prevent that seesawing motion really. and then you know that every small little tap of the hammer you put on into the engine, it will actually move the cylinder head up a bit. Again, as you remove the cylinder head, just make sure that you have a way of securing the timing chain to stop it falling down the engine. With the cylinder head removed, I've decided to remove the shims and the lifters. They're purely held on by the suction of the oil, so I found a small metal pick was sufficient to get underneath these and remove them from the head. When bagging these, just make sure you make a note of which position they were in so that you can make sure they go back into the same place. At this point, I also decided to remove the 4 spark plugs. At this point you can also remove the front cam chain tensioner bolt. There's one further bolt on the cam chain tensioner inside, and with these removed the cam chain tensioner can be lifted clear. At this point you're probably going to be able to see the tops of the pistons for the first time. As you can see here, I've got lots of flaky bits of carbon on mine. There's quite a lot of debris in here. I really don't know where it's all come from, but I'm certainly glad I've removed it so I can give it a good clean. The lower front edge of the cylinders has a single bolt which can now be removed. This releases the cylinders. Again, I've used a block of wood and some packing plastics to remove this. As you lift the cylinders off, it's important not to let the pistons in the upright position fall down. So here I've got pistons 1 and 4 in the raised position. Just make sure they don't clatter down too hard and damage themselves. At this point you can remove the cylinder gasket. As you can see on my engine, I've got a huge amount of debris that sat on this. To avoid any unnecessarily falling down into the bottom casing, just run a vacuum over it or clean this off. Finally, in this video we're going to remove the pistons. On each side there's 2 small piston pin clips. I removed these with a small pick and a pair of needle nose pliers. They are held under a surprising amount of tension, so I do recommend wearing a pair of safety glasses when you do this. They will need replacing, so if they do ping off across the room, don't worry too much. You're going to have to buy new ones anyway. With the piston pin clips removed, you can just remove the piston pins. You can either do this using a small pair of needle-nose pliers, or I also found that a Sharpie pushed through the rear of these removes them very effectively. Once you've removed 2 of the pistons, you're going to have to turn the engine for 180 degrees so that you can access the piston pins on the remaining 2 pistons. And just because I wanted to see what sort of state they're in, the pistons as they came out, I gave them a quick clean and then just Scotch Brighted them. You can see here how quickly that carbon comes off and he ended up with a lovely shiny top. So guys, that's probably a good spot to wrap up this video. Before we do, let's take a moment to summarise what we're going to do before we get this engine running again. First of all, the top end looks pretty manky, to be honest. It looks like you could do with a good clean, including lapping all of the valves, checking the tolerances, and I'm also going to replace all of the valve seals with slightly higher spec ones. I'll probably cover this in part 3 or 4 of the rebuild series. I wasn't planning on rebuilding the bottom end, but looking at the sheer amount of debris that was sat on the cylinder gasket, I think a lot of it will probably have ended up in the crankcase. It's not a small task splitting this, so I do take the decision fairly heavily, but I feel like if I don't open that up and clean out any debris that's in there, it's going to give me a lot more problems long term with the bike. So I'm going to be doing that in episode 2, splitting the crankcase and giving it a good clean through. Externally on the engine, we're definitely going to give it a thorough clean. I'm possibly going to vapor blast it, or at least I'll be cleaning off all the corrosion and painting the engine, possibly polishing a few of the covers. But I'm going to start on the rebuild in earnest. So first of all, it's going to need new gaskets and seals throughout the engine. It looks like these haven't been touched since it left the factory, or certainly not in living memory. So I'm definitely going to be replacing all of those. I'm going to go through and check the bearings as I go, make sure if there's any of those that need replacing, I do that as I go. And also I'm just going to check over the clutch, make sure there's enough life left in it to give me many, many years of hassle-free motoring. Finally, the carbs are all stripped down and removed, ready for vapor blasting. I'll be doing a video showing those being split down, and then a second rebuild video that'll be coming on the channel soon. So if you're interested in seeing how I do the carbs, make sure you hit subscribe. Guys, that's about it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's helped you out with something. If it has, really appreciate a thumbs up beneath. If you've got any questions or any comments on these dual overhead cam engine rebuilds or the channel in general, please do hit me a comment below. I'd really appreciate it. I'll get the next video up as soon as possible, pandemic pending. If you want to be told as soon as it comes out, do make sure you hit that subscribe button. Until next time, take care of yourself and stay safe. Cheers.